The mystical Vedic cosmos. What is it? And how does it relate to our modern concepts of astronomy? And how does it inform our astrological symbolisms? In the Bhagavad Purana, 5th book, chapter 20, Shuka explains the Bhu beyond the Bhu, the world beyond the world, the remote corners of our cosmos, the Bhumandala. He presents a model in which there is a cosmos with empty space and occupied space. He calls this the Lok and Alok. So what does he mean by Lok, or the occupied space? This is the part of the cosmos where there are forces like gravity, and therefore things can be held and kept. They can have a place, they can have a loka or a locus or a location. And this is where you'll find things like planets, etc. Outside of that, and doubling it in area, is the alok, or the unoccupied zone. Now, it's not necessarily entirely empty, but nothing can permanently establish its position there. This is because there are no forces like gravity working to hold anything in there. So if anything enters that area, it just passes through it and disappears. Now, obviously, the more detailed part of the cosmos is the occupied space, because it has stuff in it. So let's take a look at that. What Shuka does and what the Vedas do, what the Puranas explain, is the occupied area of the cosmos has 7 zones to it. And these zones are arranged concentrically from our conceptual center, or our observational center, which is our world, our perspective. This is a description from our point of view, the human point of view. Now, these zones, however, are not equal in size. In fact, each interior zone is 4 times smaller, or a fourth of the zone that's exterior to it. So it looks more like this, and you have to zoom in to be able to see all the zones, because the ones that are interior are so much smaller than the ones that are exterior. So here you can see the 7th zone, called pure, or swadu, and the 6th zone inside it, much smaller than it. It's called Dadhimanda, which basically means it's thinning things out. I'll explain all these terms in much more detail later, and as we explore it in upcoming episodes. If you zoom in a little bit more, you can see the 5th zone, the nourishing zone, Kshira. You zoom in more, you can see the 4th, the luminous zone, the empowering zone. The enjoyable zone, which is adjacent to ours, which is called the caustic, or the briny, or the salty zone. So these are the 7 concentric zones of loka, of the occupied part of the cosmos. Each one of those zones has a subdivision within it. Each one is divided into something referred to as an ocean and something referred to as an island. And the island takes up 1/3 of the zone, and the ocean takes up 2/3 of it. So let me explain this motif and this metaphor and this concept of ocean and island. Remember, the basic character of the occupied zone of the cosmos is that it has forces like gravity which can hold things in place. The Sanskrit term for holding things is di. Like when you concentrate on something, it's dhiman. You hold a thought, it's dhyana, or dhimahi. You focus on something. So the zones are thought of as udadhi, the things that are the holding zones. And that's the word for ocean, because the ocean holds water. It keeps water, which is, otherwise it moves around all the time, water, right? But the ocean manages to hold it in place, so we call it udadhi. So this metaphor is being used for this area of space that can hold things and keep things in place. The term island is the Sanskrit word dvipa. One of the etymologies for the word dvipa is that it's drinking, or pa, from all around it, dvi, from 2 sides, from both sides. And this is what they call an island, because the island seems to pull the sediments, drink the sediments out of the ocean and pile them up. But here, in the sense of the cosmos, it's important and informative to call this area the island, because it conveys the sense that this island has coagulated or been produced by the ocean, which is similar to the modern concept of how the planets have formed from belts of gas. Another term that refers to the oceans in this 20th chapter is parika. Parika is like a moat. And that's another important aspect of the ocean motif. Oceans, moats, bodies of water, they block our access to the other shore. They block our access to other lands, to other islands. We have to work hard to cross the oceans. And so that also is a good metaphor to explain space. And furthermore, another thing about oceans is that we can't live there. We live on islands, not in the oceans. And so therefore, it's yet another way that this metaphor really works well to explain space and planets. So in contrast to this parika concept, the dvipa also means that it has apas on both sides. It has water on both sides, means it's a safe place. And so the word dvipa implies a place of safety, shelter, and refuge. So in other words, it's the place in the cosmos where life can thrive. So now we know there's an empty area in the cosmos, like a void, and then there's an area with stuff permanently in it. Within that, there's these 7 zones, and each zone has these 2 divisions, an ocean and an island. That's not the end. Inside each island zone is the actual spot which is inhabited. And this is usually referred to as a tree on the island. And the sense of that metaphor is that birds live in the trees, the animals come under the tree and live under the shade. People live under the shade of trees, and so forth. So you have this image now. The zones, they scale dramatically, as you remember. The more you go out, the huger they get by a factor of 4. The more you go in, the smaller they get by 4s. But these trees, these actual inhabitable places within the island zones, they don't scale. So while you're on the inner zones, these things look pretty big compared to their surrounding zone. But when you get to the outer zone, these things look quite tiny. So now if we review again the 7 zones, we have the 7th, the pure zone, which has the Swadu ocean, which is the delicious ocean, let's say. It can mean something like completely clean water. And the island zone here is called Pushkara, and the occupiable space, or the actual planet probably, is this burning, flaming, gigantic lotus flower. So it's probably the sun. So that's going to prove interesting when we try to make this correlate to modern observations by astronomers. It's not going to correspond exactly to a modern solar system model, probably. If we zoom in and we go to the 6th zone, this is the zone of thinning. The ocean is called Dardhimanda, which means whey, like when you separate curds and whey from the milk. Or it can also mean the sap of a tree. And the island zone is called Shaka, which means the leaf, or like a leafy vegetable. And the little occupied area, which is small in comparison to the zones now because we're in the outer zone, is the actual Shaka tree, which is like a teak tree. Then in the 5th zone, it's the nourishing zone. So the ocean here is called Shira, which means milky. And the island is called Krauncha, which is a sea hawk. And this occupiable space here in Krauncha Island is a mountain. And there's some interesting details about this mountain that we'll get into it in future episodes where we look at the details. Zooming into the 4th area, the luminous zone, the ocean is oil or ghee, stuff that you can ignite, stuff that you can set a flame. And the island is called grass, because grass is what you burn. And the occupiable area is a meadow of grass. And the metaphor says that the meadow of grass looks like the flames coming up from the container of oil. Zoom in a little bit further to the third zone, which is the empowering zone. Now we're getting closer to home. This is an ocean of sura, which is liquor, distilled liquids. And the island is called Shalmala, which is a silk cotton tree, and the inhabitable area is an actual silk cotton tree. The second zone, called the enjoyable zone, well, it's very sweet. The ocean is Ikshurasa, which is sugar juice. And the island is a fig, Plaksha. The actual planet within this zone, that orbits within the zone, is described as the actual tree. Then finally, we have our zone. Within the briny, the caustic, the salty water, we have our rose apple tree, the jambu. So those are the 7 zones divided into their oceans and their islands and their actual inhabitable part of the island. Now here's a diagram that will give you a sense of the scale of this cosmic model. You can see when you zoom in very close to the center, you can see several zones at once. You can see Jambu, Plaksha, Shalmala, and Kusha. Zoom out or move to the outside, you start to get these huge spaces, Krauncha, and then a lot of nothing, Shaka, and then even more nothing. And then finally you get the Pushkara, and then a whole lot of this nothing, or this ocean of pure water, and then finally the Loka ridge, or the edge of the inhabitable space. Then you enter into the uninhabitable space beyond that. So that's our first look at the basic model of the Vedic cosmos. Let's call it the mystical cosmos. There's a lot more to come in this series. For each inhabitable place, each of these 7 inhabitable places, Shuka is going to divide each one into 7 geographical zones, and each one is going to have qualities to it denoted by their names, mountains, and rivers. He's also going to describe the quality of life from the inhabitants of those zones. And he does so by naming the 4 archetypes of human beings in certain ways. And finally, he's going to explain the divine power of that place by explaining the theological perspective of the inhabitants there. So all of those things are really going to give us a rich source of correlation to our astrological symbolism for the planets that correspond to these zones. And it's also going to be extremely interesting, if not quite difficult, to figure out what astronomical correlations there are to actual physical astronomy. That's going to be coming up in the upcoming videos that we do on this chapter of Book 5 of Bhagavad Purana, Srimad Bhagavatam. I encourage you to make sure you don't miss those installments, subscribe, hit the bell. Meanwhile, also, I would request you to go over to my website, vicdekara.com, and you can read up on the published versions of the translations of books 1, 2, 3, and 4 of this Bhagavatam. Thank you so much.